So today we're going to be discussing three major topics. The first of those is going to be regarding common objections against Islam. Okay, common objections against Islam. I'm going to be discussing, this is probably going to be the more unsettling or maybe the more uncomfortable part of the session, because a lot of the things that you're going to read and that I'm going to tell you are very insulting to our religion, and they're very insulting to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, this is actually my blog. I do have a personal blog, which I haven't written on for like, I don't know how long now, but I do have some articles on there. And one of the major things that I started to address when I first came to Islam was some of these objections. And eventually, I came to realize what the main objections were. And they're usually ethical objections. So the first one that you probably hear all the time, and that probably bothers you the most, and bothers me the most, is regarding the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his marriage to Aisha. And this is probably the most common thing that's brought up by Islamophobes, people who hate Islam. And they will always accuse the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam of having an immoral relationship with a young girl. Okay? Now, prior to getting into my argument, the refutation of this, I just want to say that some other da'is and other ulama have come to the conclusion that Aisha was not actually the age that she was when she was married, meaning that the hadith that says that she was 9 is wrong. I do not agree with this position. I believe that the hadith is perfectly fine, and that the problem is not the hadith, the problem is our understanding of the past. So I have taken a different position, and I consider this to be the more traditional opinion, so I'm going to discuss it. Now yesterday I mentioned this argument to you, and I said that I would use evolution to prove my point. So I'm going to show you how that works. Okay? So first off, as we all know, the common accusation is that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam should have not married a 9-year-old girl, because in our day and age that's considered to be extremely immoral, because a girl of that age cannot be mature. Is this correct? Or it's nearly impossible for a girl to be mature. Alright, well, not only is this an incorrect way to approach the subject, but it's very ignorant of how people used to develop in the past. And I do mean only 1400 years ago. Okay? Can you go down? This article was actually written in response to a particular atheist who is popular online. So you'll see his name mentioned throughout. So the first two evidences, and here we're using fallacies too, so I'm going to read something too. This all connects, okay? So here the atheist effectively has committed the fallacy of suppressed evidence, or he has not shown you all the evidence regarding the subject, okay, by not mentioning some important factors that run contrary to the conclusions. Okay. So for instance, if we look at evolutionary biology, or what we call life history theory today in certain circles, they have claimed themselves within the past few years that the problem of using biological age, meaning the age 9, 10, 11, 12, those are what we call biological ages, okay? All right, to determine the social age of a child is becoming more widely acknowledged in the literature, all right? While the claim the biological basis of childhood cannot be contested, seems reasonable, one should be aware of its limitations. So, first off, many scientists who study evolutionary biology, who study the evolution of human development, have suggested that it's difficult to determine the actual maturity of somebody, both socially and even physically, simply based on their age. And you're going to see why. If we can continue, please. A little bit down. Okay. So Fowler says, much of the tension in the investigation of age in the past arises from the assumption that we can link biological to social age. This desire to turn biological categories into social ones by creating implicit and direct links between the two causes problems. distinction between child and adult are the product of the current limitations of osteological methods, meaning how we determine bone age. For any of you here who are scientists, who have studied anything regarding anatomy, okay? For age estimation in adults, and that using biological development standards for aging results in the construction of artificial divisions of social and mental development. So what they're trying to say here, I'm going to break it down very simply, is that just because the bones have a certain age to them, and just because they show that the girl or the boy was 9 or 10 or 11, does not mean that person is the same as a 9 or 10 or 11, 12-year-old today. Okay? And there are many reasons for that. So can we go a little further down? Here we go. This is where it gets interesting. Human beings are the most cognitively flexible species on the planet, and infants and young children are sensitive to early environmental conditions that can alter their path of development, based on current conditions and anticipation of future conditions. Along these lines, some people have proposed the concept of something called conditional adaptations. Okay? So in evolutionary life history theory, we have something called conditional adaptations, meaning that depending on your environment, your body and your mental development will also be different, depending, for instance, how long you're going to live. Okay? How harsh is your environment? Right? How much education, for instance, do you go through? Okay? Children living in different environments develop different cognitive or behavioral strategies in anticipation of the environment they will likely inhabit as adults. All right, so meaning that children will develop to anticipate or to adapt to their future conditions. So they may develop faster, they may develop slower. Okay? A little bit farther down, please. Thank you. Conditional adaptations underpin development of contingent survival and reproductive strategies. Viewed from within this framework, the adolescent who responds to a dangerous environment by developing insecure attachments, adopting an opportunistic interpersonal orientation, engaging in a range of externalizing behaviors, and sustaining an early sexual debut, is no less functional than the adolescent who responds to a well-resourced and supportive social environment by developing the opposing characteristics. Meaning what they're trying to say is that, you know, these kids who grow up and the teenagers who go out and they start acting like adults at very young ages, they want to be sexually active at very young ages, it's usually due to the fact of the environment that they grew in. Okay? Go down. Sorry. Okay, and this is where the main argument comes in. That the environment can influence growth and development trajectories during pre-adult life history stages is well established, meaning the scientific community believes that this is well established. Okay, that conditions, your environmental conditions can affect your maturity, can affect your growth at a very early stage. All right. In general terms, high mortality regimes favor relatively early production, meaning if you're likely to die at the age of 30, you will most likely begin to reproduce at a much earlier age. Okay, because you don't have much to live, much longer to live. So if your lifespan is going to be 30 or 40 years old, then you're probably going to start having kids around the age, probably as a teenager or less than that, because you only have another 20 years to raise them before you have to die, right? So if, for instance, in the Arab world, if your lifespan was 30 or 40, which was common prior to the move to Medina, we're going to discuss that later, okay? Being married at 9 or 10 was quite common, because by the time that you had a child, you'd be around 20, you'd be considered middle-aged. And then by the time you were 30 or 40, you'd be dead. So you didn't have much time to raise your children. So the bottom line is that people simply did not live as long or as healthy in the past. Many women died right after childbirth, and the need to have many children who would later be left without parents would have triggered youth in the past to mature faster so that society could still function. Okay? Death was something of a greater reality for children, and as such, they had to adapt accordingly. Today is a little different. This is the mic is a little bit, it's playing tricks on me. Okay, if we can go down a little bit. Here we go. Dvoretsky and Meskel say that no matter what period we are examining, childhood is more than a biological age, but a series of social and cultural events and experiences that make up a child's life. The time at which these transitions take place varies from one culture to another and has a bearing on the level of interaction children have with their environment, their exposure to disease and trauma, and their contribution to the economic status of the family and society. The Western view of childhood, where children do not commit violence and are asexual, has been challenged by studies of children that show them learning to use weapons or being depicted in sexual poses in the past. Okay? What is clear is that we cannot simply transpose our view of childhood directly onto the past, meaning we cannot, when we call this anachronistic, is when we try to impose history or we try to impose present day understanding of things onto the past events. Because the conditions in which we live today are vastly different. Okay? Can you just go down a little bit? Okay, stop. So, when we get to the hadith, we notice that Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, said that when a girl reaches 9 years of age, she is a woman. She stated this herself. During her time period, she considered herself and other girls at her age at that time to be women. Why would she say that if she didn't actually believe this to be the case? Now, I've shown this hadith to some anti-Islamic individuals and Islamophobes in general, and they usually say, well, she must be lying. But then at the same time, they'll say, but the hadith that says that the Prophet ﷺ married her when she was 9, that's true. But this one is she's lying. So they like to pick and choose which hadith support their opinions and which don't. So here Aisha herself, from her own testimony, is saying that when I was 9 years old, I was mature. And the girls around me, when they became 9, they were mature. So that's very interesting. Can you keep going a little bit farther down? I'm just going to show the evidences. Okay. So, before we get into these, I'm going to give you another example. Actually, no, let's just go through with this one. Another objection is that the Islamophobes will go through the hadith literature and they'll find instances where Aisha was playing with her dolls. Okay, I don't know if you know that she's playing with dolls when she was in the presence of the Prophet. So they'll say, look, you see, she's being a child. She's too immature. So she shouldn't have been married at this age, okay? So Aisha said, I used to play with the dolls in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ, and my girlfriends also used to play with me. When Allah's apostle used to enter my dwelling place, they used to hide themselves, but the Prophet ﷺ would call them to join and play with me. The playing with the dolls and similar images is forbidden, but it was allowed for Aisha at the time, as she was still a little girl not reached the age of puberty. Fadl Bari. Okay? Now, this part here, okay, I don't know if you can see it in the back, alright, the one with the parentheses, that's not actually part of the hadith. That's a commentary, okay, by Hajar al-Asqalani, alright, written in 428, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. This is important to note because while this commentary is one of the most famous in Islam, Ibn Hajar's explanation was based on a particular methodology. If we can go up a little bit, I'll explain this. So, when some people read this hadith, actually if you go onto many websites where you have hadith literature, this hadith here always has those parentheses around it. Has that little statement at the end. Why? Most of these websites that have hadith literature are not run by Muslims. Okay? And those that are run by Muslims tend to just copy the hadith from the other websites and put it on their own. Okay? Now this is problematic because a lot of those hadith are not just hadith. A lot of the hadith have commentary next to them and are considered part of the hadith. So when we read hadith online, we need to be very cautious, especially when we see parentheses after a particular statement, because that could have been included by somebody else. Okay? Can we go, sorry. Done. Sorry. Okay. Here was the reason for that comment. All right. Okay, Ibn Hajar explains this hadith. He says, first he explains another hadith. He said, when the Apostle of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, arrived at the expedition of Tabuk, Khaybar, the narrator is doubtful. The drought raised an end of a curtain which was hung in front of her storeroom, revealing some dolls which belonged to her. The Prophet ﷺ asked, "What is this?" She replied, "My dolls." Among them he saw a horse and wings, etc., etc. And can we go down further? Okay, so he explains what some other scholars said about this hadith. Al-Khattabi said, "From this hadith it is understood that playing with dolls is not like the amusement from other images concerning which the threat of punishment is mentioned. The only reason why permission in this was given to Aisha is because she had not at that time reached the age of puberty." Okay, so this is one opinion by one of the scholars. Al-Hafiz goes on to say with certainty that she has not reached the age of puberty is questionable, okay, though it might possibly be so. This is because Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, was a 14-year-old girl at the time that this hadith was revealed. 14. Okay. At the Battle of Khaybar, either exactly 14 or having just passed her 14th year. All right. As for her age at the time of the Battle of Tabuk, she had by then definitely reached the age of puberty. Therefore, the strongest view is that of those who said it was Khaybar. Okay. And the reason that he picked this view, okay, for her to be 14 when she was playing with dolls, is because he had a particular methodology in mind. All right. He was not looking at historical evidence. He was not trying to figure out whether or not she was mature. The fact of the matter, he picked this opinion and he said that she was not mature is because he just wanted to fix a contradiction among certain hadith that he had read. Right, that was the main reason. It was not because of any other, that was just his methodology. But he even admits himself that when she was playing with these dolls, she was 14. 14. Do you mean to tell me that by the time you're 14, you haven't reached at least some level of physical or mental maturity enough to, I mean, in today's age, when does a girl start to become mature? Okay, I'm sorry to ask this question, ladies, but it's around 11, 12? Beginning in our modern period. And yet Islamophobes will use this hadith, which mentioned when she was 14, which is 3 years longer than that, 3 years above that, and say she did not reach puberty yet. It doesn't make any sense. And the only reason that the scholar mentioned she didn't reach puberty is because he wanted to protect Aisha from the accusation that you can't play with dolls. So is there something wrong with the accusation, or is there something wrong with his idea of maturity? We have to decide upon that. But if we were to look at the commentary, I would say that he is incorrect about her not having reached puberty. She just played with dolls at that time. Maybe we don't know exactly the context of why she was playing with the dolls, but it's very certain that she was 14 years old. 14. Okay, so she was beyond 9 at this point in time. This is 5 years after she had consummated with the Prophet, right? So she had to have at least, she's a teenager. So we know this. So this hadith of her playing with dolls cannot be used against the Prophet or Aisha in any way whatsoever. Okay, if we can go down a little bit, please. Okay, this hadith is very important, and I want you to memorize it. Actually, the reference is down below. I'll show it to you in a moment, but write it down in a moment if you wish to. Narrated Aisha, I had seen my parents following Islam since I attained the age of puberty. Not a day passed but the Prophet ﷺ visited us both in the mornings and evenings. This is prior to her marriage, because she was still living with her parents. She had reached puberty prior to her marriage with the Prophet. This is direct evidence. Anyone who says that she did not reach puberty prior to consummation is false. This is a falsehood, because we have direct evidence from Aisha herself that says she had reached puberty at that time prior to consummation. Okay? And if we can go all the way down, can we see the reference? I believe this is 15. Number 15, please. Oh, lovely. Sahih Bukhari. I did forget. This is a Sahih Hadith. Volume 1, Book 8, number 465. So this is not controversial. This is not a hadith that we can just throw away, and this is not something that can be questioned. Okay, this is direct testimony that she had reached puberty prior to the marriage. So any Islamophobe that says she didn't, you show them this hadith. And that's it. Okay? But I will tell you this, that even if you present this information here, okay, the first one I just gave to you, they will still deny. They will still say there's something wrong with your religion that allows you to marry a 9-year-old girl. No matter how much you show them. Because they still have it in mind that for some reason 9-year-old means immature. Because they're only thinking about this time period. Okay? And if we can go down. Oh, yeah, we'll start with this paragraph here. And this ties into one of their major beliefs that we mentioned yesterday, progressionism. Progressionism. We become more moral and more advanced in today's period than we did in the past. And it ties in that the reason that people married young back then is because they didn't know any better. Okay, it's because they were ignorant or because they didn't understand what maturity was. All right. So this is one of the major reasons or major influences upon the atheist mindset. This is why they cannot understand that maybe just back then there were different conditions which did not allow for the possibility of certain things to occur. And the way that I explain this, can we go all the way down to the model at the bottom, please? The way that I explain this is very simple. Okay, go down all the way. Oh, here we go. Great. And I actually gave this a philosophical name for the theory that I'm about to present you. It's called normative circumstantial morality. You don't have to remember that, but basically we call it circumstantial morality, okay? So I made a little bit of a chart here. So I said, let's say that we're all trying to reach happiness, okay? Can everyone read this? Can see this little diagram? Can we see the diagram? Or can we click? Okay, great. So let's say we have happiness. Everyone wants happiness, right? So we're trying to achieve a happy state in our society, okay? Now, the conditions or the circumstances one, are 600 CE Arabia. Okay, so we're talking about 1400 years ago, right? Now, this was written in 2013, so it's a little off. So now we're 2015, okay? So, the global world. So let's see the differences. Closer knit societies, lack of universal global awareness and interaction, less access to natural resources, less modified food sources and pollution, less technologically advanced infrastructure and tools, less complex economic models, shorter lifespan and more severe health conditions, lesser knowledge base, more actively engaged youth, and can we go up a little? No. Yeah, down. In society, biological, cognitive, and belief development based on the above, all are universal to every society, grammar problem, and rarely, if ever, changed. Now let's look at the right. Okay? Less close-knit societies, universal global awareness and interaction, more access to natural resources, more modified food sources and pollution, okay? More technologically advanced infrastructure and tools, more complex economic models, longer lifespan and less severe health concerns, more knowledge base, less actively engaged youth in society, and biological, cognitive, and belief systems based on all the above. All right, so these are the differences. Now I'm going to give you, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to see how you answer. Say I have a time machine, okay? We'll just make, there's no time machines, but let's say we have a time machine. I ask you to go back to this period, okay? And you see people living the way that they live, with all of these conditions different from the ones that you live in here. Would it be moral for you to take the laws of this world and to apply it to them? For instance, say, oh, you're not allowed to marry until you're 18. I'm sorry. When people were about to die around 10 years later. Would that society thrive, or would it probably pass away in about 100 years? It would probably pass away in 100 years. And why is that? Because the conditions for that law to be possible are not in place. It is impossible to tell people you have to wait till you're 18 to get married. Because by the time they're 18, they're already like old. So for them, it would be waiting too long. For them, it'd be like, we can't do this. I mean, I don't even expect to live for the next 20 years. I have to have a family now, I have to start working. What if we told them you can't ride a camel, you can't have a job until you're an adult by our standards, until you're 18? What are all these kids going to do? They don't have high school. They don't have primary education. What are they taught to do? How to tend sheep, how to go to war, how to hunt. So what, you're going to tell them, I'm sorry, you cannot do this until you're 18. But the reason we do that now is because what? We have 12 years of education, and after that we have university, before you can get a nice job, all these other, so we have to wait until we're financially able to afford a family and to succeed in life. And of course we have all the time in the world because we also have longer lifespans, we have better health, so we can live up to 60, 70, 80 years old, so we have enough time to wait to get married or to consider ourselves mature. Okay, enough to do certain things. Back then they did not have these options. So if we were to take our common law system and go back in time and say, okay, now you need to follow this because you are immoral, you don't know any better, they would probably all die because the conditions that we have in our society are not there. So this is how atheists, in their following of progressionism, mistake morality in the past as being something that was wrong because they don't understand that the conditions were different. Okay, so what they do, maybe indirect or maybe unconsciously or subconsciously, without really being aware of it, is that they think the conditions were similar throughout time. So they say, marrying a 9-year-old is wrong because the conditions back then were the same as they would be now, and that people don't mature faster based on those conditions. Okay? But that is actually false. And the reason that I came up with this argument is because of my understanding of evolutionary theory. So the reason I even understood or tried to move in that direction and try to explain these conditions and adaptations and things is because I follow evolutionary theory. Okay, so when a lot of Muslims, and I'm not saying anybody in the room, tells me that we should not believe this understanding of theory, I'm not saying we should believe all of it, but I'm saying that the basic foundations of it, I ask them, are you sure? Because it sure does help, especially in explaining certain things that are much more difficult to explain otherwise. So when you understand evolution, for instance, this idea that I'm explaining to you becomes very easy to understand. It becomes very acceptable. So, and you're probably wondering, well, atheists, they like evolution. They love evolution, so why don't they understand this? It's because they probably don't. If a lot of people think that just because atheists are obsessed with science, that they must know everything about science. But in fact, most of the time, they know just as much as everyone else, which is very little. So they use science as a beating stick on religion. But most of them don't actually know anything about it. So when you come in and you teach them something about it, they get very offended. To me, it's most interesting that the scholars were already thinking in this pattern prior to the concept of evolution or the concept of different conditions throughout time. They were already thinking about conditions because of the fact that the Quran and the Sunnah did not limit certain things. So they had more of open access to information. So the nature of Islamic law, okay? If we can go up a little bit. Okay, stop. Okay, so there's a flexibility in Islamic law. Do we understand this? There's a certain flexibility in Islamic law, okay? And it's the flexibility of having concern for public interest. Having concern for public interest. Okay, so for instance, everyone understands or has heard of the event during the time of the Caliphate of Umar al-Khattab, correct? During the time when he was running the Islamic polity, and what had occurred during that time? There was a drought. Is that the case? There was a drought, right? And people were starving, and they were stealing lots of food because they were starving. And he canceled the punishment for theft. Is this true? Yes, it is true. He canceled the punishment. He basically, we didn't cancel it, but he He postponed it, thank you, it's a better word. He postponed the punishment for theft because he knew that it would be unjust to punish people who were starving to death. So Islam allows for certain conditions to change the application of law. All right? So conditions matter within Islamic legal theory. So let's look at the passage from the Quran. Test orphans until they reach marriageable age. Then if you find that they have sound judgment, hand over their property to them. Do not consume it hastily before they come of age. So the Quran already mentions that there is a marriageable age, but what does that mean? Okay. If we look at Ibn Kathir's tafsir, we say that Allah commands that the property of the orphans be surrendered to them in full when they reach the age of adolescence. So according to the Quran, marriageable age is just when you reach adolescence, when you've reached a stage of puberty. Okay? So there is no set age by number. It's simply based on your biological and mental development. That is it. All right? Okay. And he gave the conditions for puberty. He said the age of puberty, according to the majority of scholars, comes when the child has a wet dream. And can you go down a little bit more? I'm sorry. The age of 15 is considered the age of adolescence by many to be the maximum age. Okay? And go down. Sorry. Okay. But however, when you read this, you need to understand something else. When the scholars believed that puberty started at a physical time, meaning a wet dream, okay, or menstrual cycle, when your menstrual cycle starts, all right, they did not simply assume that puberty was a physical event, but they believed that when that physical event occurred, that your mental processes also followed. So when they say that if the girl starts bleeding, they didn't just mean, okay, that's it. She's mature. No, they assume that when she starts bleeding that she's also thinking in a different way. So that's why they only mention certain conditions, because they didn't think that they were separated. Now, there is an interesting part though in the Quran. And there's also something else. First off, the majority position of all classical scholars held that minors could be contracted in marriage by their guardians, although consummation was not permitted until the minor was physically ready to enter a sexual relationship. Okay, that's why the Prophet ﷺ had married Aisha, actually engaged Aisha, had a nikah contract with her at 6, but consummated at 9. Because there's something else they don't understand, is that there's two versions of the contract within Islam. Okay, go down a little bit. Stop. Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. And I'm going to mention, there's another Quranic ayah that Islamophobes like to use, and it's basically there's an ayah in the Quran that states that for those who have not menstruated, okay, for those who have not menstruated, their period, their iddah period is still 3 months, okay, which suggests that that you can consummate with them prior to them reaching menstruation, meaning that you can have sex if you're married to them prior to them menstruating. Okay, so you're saying, okay, this is a problem. And many Islamophobes will mention this this ayah saying, okay, see, so you can have sex with a girl who's not mature yet. But the scholars, that's not right. That's not what it means. The Quran was actually mentioning a very rare event that actually happens in today's world. There are many girls, not many, but there is a sizable minority that doesn't menstruate yet matures physically. Okay? This is a condition that some women have. Some women don't start menstruating until the age of 17, yet they've developed fully formed bodies and they look like adults. This is what the Quran was mentioning, because the scholars, and the scholars interpreted it this way by saying, a marriage could be contracted before either party was ready for sexual intercourse, but a marriage could not be consummated until both bride and groom were physically mature. Such maturity was not equated with puberty, the marker of legal majority, but rather could be reached before its onset. For a girl, readiness for sexual intercourse was signaled in large part by her appearance, by whether or not she had become an object of desire, fleshy or buxom. I'm sorry to say these words, but I'm just speaking legal terminology, meaning that if she became what a normal adult would consider to be sexually desirable, what a normal man would consider not a pedophile, not somebody who had a problem like that, but the normal community. So any man, if they saw this woman and they thought she looked like a woman, then she was sexually prepared. So that's how they judged it. So even if she had not reached menstruation yet, if she looked like a woman, then they considered her mature enough. So they even judged the sexual maturity of an individual based on different factors, not simply based on whether they bled or whether they had certain things. They also examined to see if that person was sexually prepared. So they were very conscious of this. So anyone who says that, oh, Islam allows you to marry children and have sex with them, this is, no. This is completely wrong. This is completely wrong. Okay. So, what is more is that while the age of 9 in Islamic law is considered the minimum for when such physical mental maturation can take place, it is never mentioned as one of the conditions by which to judge puberty or physical maturation. Unlike the current state that we're in like the modern world, where we consider maturity based on age. So we say we have a legal maturity of 18, and we have a sexual maturity, some people say 16 and above, okay? But in Islam, we don't mention age. There's no such thing in our concept of maturity. It just happens to be the case that you may be possible to be mature at 9. That just happened to be the case. If Aisha had become mature at 12, it still wouldn't have mattered. We wouldn't say, okay, when the girl reaches 12, then you can get married to her and consummate the marriage. But anybody who argues along these grounds is not actually arguing based on Islamic legal concepts, because age, the number, makes no difference at all. So yes, are we allowed, does Islamic law allow for a girl to be married at the age of 9? Yes, under appropriate conditions. Does it allow a girl to be married at the age of 9 today? No, because the conditions are not there. That's it. So the allowance is there, but not for us. So you see the flexibility. It's really dependent on the conditions of the human maturation process, their mental maturation, etc., etc. Go down. Okay, so, and I give a short summary. I said, given contemporary circumstances where men and women live in an environment where the world economy and nature of education requires individuals to have to study longer and by extension mature much more slowly, as opposed to children of the past who had shorter lifespans and opportunities, Islamic law is fully prepared within the limits of its own principles and goals to accommodate the current environment and thus not force upon people early marriage. Therefore, we conclude that on the basis of scientific research and the true nature of Islamic law, that those who make this accusation are incorrect. But at the same time, this is something that I also wrote for the sake of other Muslims to read, because we do have Muslims in this world, whether based on ignorance or otherwise, I'm not going to make a judgment, who state that it's okay to marry a 9-year-old girl today, for no reason other than the fact that the Prophet ﷺ did it. And that is wrong. Because we have to also understand why. We can't just be like, okay, she's 9, therefore it's okay. And we have instances, for instance in Afghanistan and other places, where there are old 60, 70-year-old men who are marrying these young children who haven't even matured yet, because they assume her maturity is based on her age, which is completely wrong. So I mean, for lack of better terms, and I'm sorry to sound so blunt, but they're committing rape. This is what they're doing, based on their misunderstandings, or even perhaps their bad intentions of exploiting Islamic legal terminologies or Islamic law to do what they wish. But our law is completely against this. It's completely against this. We are not allowed, because there's no conditions, under any conditions in this time period, to marry anyone of that age. And I'm talking also about boys. You know, the boys today too are not mentally or physically mature at that period of time, 11, 12 even, to be married. And I would even argue, and we have a lot of issues in the Muslim world where there's controversy, and I'm going to mention Sisters in Islam again. So they always complain when a 16-year-old or a 14-year-old get married or something here. The problem is that I find this always quite funny, to be honest, because while at the same time they complain about 16, 15, 14-year-olds getting married, they have no problem with them having sex outside of marriage at an early age, in Western societies. Nobody complains about that. If you go to the United States, for instance, it's very normal, and I'm saying this from experience of my culture, okay, it's very normal for a 13-year-old boy to lose his virginity. 13, without marriage, and it's actually okay. Nobody really complains. It's not against the law, and girls even at that age too, 13, 14 years old, lose their virginity. It's very common in the United States and Europe. In fact, in Europe recently, a banister, some of the lawyers are trying to lower the age of consent because they don't want to have all these issues because they know that they're already sexually active. But in the law books, it says you can't do that. But they know that 16, 15, 14-year-olds are all going out having sex. Okay? So while they blame the Muslim world for marrying people at 14 and 15, they're perfectly okay with their sons and daughters going out and having sex with themselves as long as they're not married. So I don't really understand the problem, but that's hypocrisy for you. So now, if you're going to ask me personally, would I be okay with a 15, 16-year-old person getting married today? I would say it depends. Normally, no, because people haven't completed their education, they're still pretty immature. If it's really like a necessity and they're, and they're already doing things they shouldn't be doing, then maybe okay, just as a precautionary measure or something. But in terms of like a normal standard, no, it's not. I don't think it's possible. And I think we should try to shy away from this if we can, because when you're 16 and even when you're 17, you still haven't really. I remember when I was 21, I look back now 9 years ago and I go, wow, I was very stupid. And then, you actually think that way until you're 25. So when I became 22, I look back when I was 21, I was like, oh, I was stupid. And then when I became 23, I look back when I was 22 and I was like, I was stupid. And I kept going until around 25. And then I stopped changing. I started being normal, Because around 25, men, they kind of physically start to level off a little bit. They stop. Women mature much faster mentally, actually. They mature around 20, and then they kind of stay that way for a little while, for most of their life. So, but men, we have this like long period of adolescence. So we may develop male bodies, fully matured male by the time we're like 20 or 21, but we still continue to be kids until we're almost 30. So it's good for a guy to get married early, but not for a woman. So anyways, that's the first argument. Do we have any questions regarding this? Is it a little bit complex, or? I need you to understand something, okay? The world is not static. Human development is not static. Societies are not static. It doesn't mean that they're progressing on a constant upward turn, but they're adaptive. Okay, so society is like a cycle, a circle. All right, depending on the conditions that we have in a society, that society will react to its environment. It'll react based on its mortality rate. It'll react based on its level of maturity in its population. It'll react based on its resources. Animals do this all the time as well. Okay, you look in a forest, for instance, and this is just a very basic understanding of evolution as well. You'll notice that animals will change the way that they behave or the way they reproduce based on the amount of resources they have and whether their environment is in danger, correct? Humans do the same thing at a more complex level. We develop laws to adapt to our environment. And Islamic law has foundational principles, okay, but at the same time, it has a level of flexibility depending on what happens within our society. So for instance, as I mentioned earlier, we can suspend certain judgments if the society is not capable of handling them. We don't go around chopping people's hands off if people are starving to death. And Islam perfectly allows this to occur because it's a mercy. It's not just a strict legal code, And actually many legal codes across the world are very much like this. They're based on conditions, okay? And they set certain standards, but sometimes they will violate those standards or change the standards in order to accommodate different situations that are unknown. That's why we have the concept of ijtihad in fiqh. in order to come up with new answers based on Islamic law. Okay? So it's not a strict thing. And the great thing, the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be seen in the Quran because He never mentions an age. He says marriageable age. So He's leaving it up to us to understand that. So He knows, Allah knows, obviously, because He's God, He knows that we change. We develop differently over time. Our maturity is different in different conditions and time periods. So He left it to us to make that decision. When are our people mature enough to be married? What is our conditions of maturity? Okay. So, anybody have any questions regarding this? Yes.
I would like to ask, is it true by your article? Is it true the morality is also evolved?
Morality does not evolve. I mean, if we're talking about evolution in an adaptive sense, I would say yes. This is how I view morality. There are normative normative standards. What we mean by normative means that things that are accepted by all. So for instance, you shouldn't kill somebody for no reason, for no good reason. Okay? Everyone believes that. Most people at least. That's normative across human populations. Now the conditions for what a good reason or not change over time. So for instance, people will give you different, like, okay, well, self-defense, I can kill somebody. That's normal, okay? I may have to kill somebody because I think they might kill me because they have a gun or something. In the United States, we have something called provocation, words of provocation. In fact, it's funny because they talk about free speech all the time, but if you feel that somebody is being threatening to you in the United States, if they're speaking a certain way, and like they're on your property or something, you can shoot them. Because you feel that person might hurt you. So you don't have to wait for them to like stab you until you start, doing something, So even they understand that there are certain circumstances where there might be justification for violence. So we would usually say violence in general is bad. But then of course, sometimes war is justified. Sometimes killing somebody is justified. Sometimes hurting somebody is justified. So those conditions might change over time. And that's a very simple example. So what I'm trying to say is that there are base level morals, okay, that the Quran will teach. It says you shouldn't steal, don't murder, don't do these things. But in certain circumstances, we can go, okay, the victim or the perpetrator of what we would usually consider a bad act, we should not punish them because the conditions in which they did that thing, it makes a difference. So also, do we punish somebody who is insane? Why? They stole something. We should cut their hands off. Why? Because they don't, so there's a condition that's been applied there. See, they're insane. They don't have proper judgment. So it's not their fault. So we can't just punish them because that would be a lack of mercy. Okay, we have to excuse them for being what they are. All right. So in this way, morality does evolve, but not in the way that you would, because when they say evolve, they mean like a gradual evolving, meaning gradual progression, right? Progressionism of going in a more advanced stage. But when I mean evolve, I'm talking about it can adapt according to your environment. And there's nothing wrong with that, because a law system or a system of a divine law that's supposed to be for all time should be able to do this, correct? Because the law doesn't change, but people do. Societies do. Our conditions change all the time. So we need a legal system that is able to apply itself during every period, right? So, and some atheists will say this, they say, well, if the law can do that, then it's not divine because it changes, etc., etc. But once again, let me reiterate, what changes is not the law, it's the conditions, and how we apply the law changes. But the law itself doesn't change. We still say murder is wrong every day. That doesn't change. But the conditions do, right? I still say stealing is wrong, but sometimes we don't apply the punishment because the conditions change. So, any other questions about this? Sisters, I apologize if this seemed a little bit uncomfortable for you because I was talking about very girly things. However, I would think that this subject is very important to you because it refers to you the most, and also Aisha, which is, other than the Prophet ﷺ was your greatest example, one of your greatest examples. So I'm hoping that if you have any questions, please ask them, because when you go online, I know this is probably the one thing that makes you more upset than the other opinions that are made against Islam. I'm very certain of that. So if you have any inquiries, please do ask me. If not, then we can move on to the next. Okay? All right then. Shall we go on? We're not going to... Actually, can we go to the Religion of Peace website? It's a very clever title. I'm actually admiring them for coming up with that title for their website, because they do that to bring Muslims in, because they say, it can't be a Islamophobic website because it says Religion of Peace. But they're being sarcastic. That's the point of it. Okay, so religionofpeace.com is an Islamophobic website, and what they love to do is they love to show how bad Islam is by showing all these ayahs of the Quran. So in this particular web page, they're mentioning the Quran and violence. And the first ayah they start with is Surah Al-Baqarah 191. Okay? It says, and kill them wherever you find them and turn them out from where they have turned you out. And fitna is worse than killing. Right? Now, does anybody notice a problem here? This is the first passage they mention in the Quran in categorical order. Meaning they're going to mention it in order from Surah Al-Baqarah all the way to the last. Okay, so is there a problem here? Can anybody see already there's a problem? Yes, they're forgetting an ayah. They didn't mention 190. So what was 990? It says, fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors. So why would they leave this very important? I mean, it's not like they forgot about it. It's right before the first.
There was justification for that.
Why would they do that? I don't know.
They have their purpose.
They have their own agenda, maybe. And in fact, this is what we call the fallacy of suppressed evidence. We're going to get into fallacies later on today. It's when you disregard, once again, I mentioned that earlier, it's when you disregard certain things to make your point. So, for instance, if you have information that contradicts your conclusions, you leave it over here and then act like it doesn't exist, and then you present your argument. Okay? And a lot of atheists like to commit this fallacy, especially when they talk about Islam. We also call this cherry picking. Okay, this is the more common term for it, is when you look in the Quran, you find what you want, and then you erase everything else, and then you show it and say, this is what the Quran says, see? It's also called quoting out of context, okay? And what it means by quoting out of context is that you do not take in reference other passages and the historical reasons behind it, etc., etc. So if we can go back to the other page, please, I'm sorry. So fight in the way of Allah those who fight you and do not transgress. Okay? And in fact, before going on, that ayah is the number one ayah to use against people who commit acts of terrorism. It's also a good ayah to use against extremists in general, because what extremists like to do is they like to state that the reason that we can kill the civilians of other people is because they kill our civilians. So we fight them like they fight us, right? But this ayah says, do not transgress. Do not go past the limits. There are limits that are made for you. So if you define your jihad based on what the kuffar do, you have no limits. So this ayah itself, it has not been abrogated, by the way. This ayah has not been abrogated. This ayah says that you have limitations of warfare. And the ulama have all been unanimous. And they state that just because they kill our civilians does not mean that we can kill theirs. Okay, so they are actually defying not only the Quran, but they're defying also the ulama in general. So that, and it's very convenient to leave it out when you're talking about jihad. So in fact, here's the funny thing. The Islamophobes use the same reasoning as the terrorists when they read the Quran. They read it the same way. There's no difference. The Islamophobes and the terrorists have the same mentality about Islam. And yet, the Islamophobes want to stop terrorism. But they're promoting a Quran or justification for certain things that the terrorists do. So at one time they say terrorism is bad, but then at the same time they say, oh, but your reasoning is okay. This is how you should read the Quran, like a terrorist. So it's interesting. So, and kill them wherever you find them and turn them out from where they have turned you out. And I want to explain their explanation here. They said the historical context of this passage is not defensive warfare. Really, since Muhammad ﷺ and his Muslims had just relocated to Medina and were not under attack by their Meccan adversaries. Is that true? No. What happened when this ayah was revealed? No. The treaty had been broken by the Quraysh. When you break a treaty in warfare, what does that mean? That means basically treason. That means that you have said, attack me. So, okay? And that means for any society. If you break a treaty, that means you want war. If we go to Surah Tawbah, right? It says very clearly in the beginning of the surah that this surah was revealed to the people who had done what? Who had broken the treaty with the Muslims. It was not to be applied to anyone else. Okay. Now later there's the verse of the sword, for instance, they mention that abrogates all the so-called defensive ayahs in the Quran, but that's also used in a very limited sense. So when it says, so there is such thing as offensive jihad in Islam. I'm not denying that. However, there are still limitations to it. So for instance, if you have a treaty with another country, you can't invade them. So the Muslims did in fact make treaties. They didn't just attack all the kuffar after, during the time of the caliphate. They didn't just, randomly invade everyone. So if they had a treaty with a certain nation, they wouldn't touch them. Okay, but if one nation, if they wanted to have a treaty and the nation said, no, we don't want to have a treaty with you, then they would go, okay, then I guess you don't want to have peace, so then they would attack. Even after having this offensive warfare, if they eventually conquered the area, they would say, okay, if you want to live the way that you're living, you want to continue living this way, as long as you don't attack us and you pay us tax, then we're fine. We're all good. Okay? And then they would leave them alone. So it wasn't like they would go into a place, completely take it over, destroy the government, install their own government there, and make everyone oppressed under one law, and then, like what certain Western countries are doing today. It was just mainly for the purpose of that nation not being hostile to Islam or the message of Islam. So when you put on the federal level a Sharia compliant or a Sharia government, basically, that means that Islam is allowed to thrive within that land. Okay, the Muslims are protected. And you take weapons away from the people who used to kill you, because one of the contracts of being a dhimmi is not just to pay jizya, it's also you cannot have weapons. Okay, it means that they can't attack you anymore. So the purpose of actually going into these lands was to make sure that Islam could thrive and open without being persecuted. So there were conditions behind offensive warfare as well. It wasn't just we go and attack you and we take over and we take everything and we leave. No, that's not how it worked. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also said very specifically, very clearly in a statement in Sahih Bukhari, he said, anyone who attacks or otherwise oppresses a dhimmi shall have to answer, I will be their witness against them on the day of judgment. So he even said of the dhimmi, the protected people who are supposed to be protected, that's what dhimmi means. Okay, we protect them. So for people who say that when Islam comes into a country, it oppresses these people when these people are supposed to be protected, and the Prophet ﷺ himself said, if you do something wrong to them, I will be a witness against you. Even if you're a Muslim, I will be a witness against you. This is something else. Okay, this is not an invasion. This is something else. All right. Shall we go down a little bit? Okay. A lot of these ayahs are just simply taken out of context. And they continue going on and on and on and on about fighting and jihad, basically jihad. And if you disbelieve, okay, well, go up, sorry. Okay, see, so here's another point of the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Quran, Surah Tawbah, ayah 5. So when the sacred months have passed away, then slay the adulterers wherever you find them, right? Now remember, what did I say? In the beginning of this surah, it explains who it's referring to, right? It's explaining it in the first 4 ayahs that they don't mention. And every time that you argue with an Islamophobe, especially somebody who considers Islam to be extremely violent, probably the first passage they ever relate to you is this one, right? Without quoting the other 4 before it. They say, see what the Quran says? It says you can kill me anytime you feel like it, for no other reason than the fact that I'm not Muslim. No. But it is true that that those who promote this idea that jihad is only about self-defense, that's incorrect. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier. However, most of the time it is the case that this is the reason for jihad. And they even say this wrong. They didn't even include the jizya here. They say, according to this verse, the best way of staying safe from the Muslims' violence is to convert to Islam. And that's it. Even though there are actually, how many conditions? There are 3 conditions, actually. There's 2 conditions. There's either you convert or you pay the tax after you've been hostile to the message, after you've been hostile to Muslims, after you've done all these things. So it's not just randomly that this occurs. Now, we had an incident happen a few months ago. It was perpetuated by the Khawarij, okay? And I'm mentioning ISIS here. So they attacked the Yazidis, a Yazidi community of pagans. They slaughtered many of them. Some of them they told to convert. Some of them did convert. And then they took the women, most of them, and they sold them into slavery. Okay? And many of those women were raped. Many of those women were sold to some of the fighters. And they said that the Quran gave them this justification. Now, the question is, what did the Yazidis do? They were there. That was the reason that they were attacked. They were just there. And they said because they were pagans. So we attacked them. That's why. And you have to wonder, in 1400 years, why nobody else attacked them until now. They've been living in Iraq since that time, since all the previous caliphates. And yet nobody bothered to kill them or force them to convert or take jizya from them or anything, nothing. But yet ISIS decides, we understand Islam more than the past 1400 generations, and we're going to go attack these people who have done nothing to us because they live on a mountain and they happen to believe differently. Let's see, are the Islamophobes following their interpretation of Islam more, or are they following the majority of Muslims in the past 1400 years? You have to decide that on your own. I think you already know the answer. Okay. You want to cut it already? Yeah. It's already time? Yeah. MashaAllah. I was going to get to the hudud. Next session. Okay, great. Okay, so, do we have any questions prior to going into the next session break? No? Anything that you have any questions? Okay, yes.
This kind of argument is in between the Muslims and the atheists, not Muslim and like other religion like Christians.
This is actually an argument that's used by everyone. Okay. But atheists tend to be the most forceful. Christians will also use these arguments. However, they're easier to pacify because if you just go to the Old Testament, they stop talking. Because the Old Testament is far worse in many respects. And not because the Torah itself is bad, but because the way that they changed it is very bad. Even the way they describe the prophets in the Torah is disgusting. You know how they mention Lot, right? Lut, Prophet Lut. They mention him as being a drunkard, having sex with his daughter, astaghfirullah. You know, and then they call him a man of God. You know, no wonder they don't like the Prophet Muhammad, because they don't even like their own prophets. Christians tend to be more easy to pacify. Jews actually are the least of your concerns. You know, I always find it interesting how we're so antagonistic against the Jews. But in fact, the Jewish people, the Orthodox, I'm not talking about the Zionists, the Jewish people themselves agree with us more than anyone. Like, most of the things they eat, we eat. The way they dress, we dress. You know, the way that they believe in warfare and things like this is very similar to us. They don't like Israel either. You know, if you look up a lot of Orthodox Jews, they're actually opposed to Israel, Zionism, and they like to help the Muslims. So, you know, we have a lot in common. Even though the Quran says that we're closest to the Christians, but now the Christians aren't even Christians anymore. They're basically atheists who go to church on Sunday for hobby. You know, it's like their social hobby, it's their social club. You know, they go there and they sing praises and then they go out and act just like everyone else. So, and you have to wonder, I know we have like 2 minutes left, but I gotta keep ranting. You have to wonder how they follow Christianity, because if you actually read the Bible, the gospel accounts, for instance, you see certain things that they don't do. Like, for instance, when Isa, in the Gospels at least, how they account him, when he prays, he goes in the sajda. He said when he gave the Lord's Prayer, his Lord's Prayer, and I can actually recite it, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, we forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. I had to memorize that when I was a young boy. I'm from Catholic school. But when he gave this prayer, he said, pray as I pray. He told his companions in the Gospels, pray as I pray. And as he recited this, they said before he recited it, he went down on the ground on his head. Do you see any Christians doing that today? They stand up and they're like, Jesus. They're singing Jesus, you know. And it's like, I don't think he told you to do this, but okay, it's fine. So, yeah, I can imagine the Gospels, start singing my name and doing this, you know. So it's interesting when you read the Gospel accounts, you can actually see that the Gospels retained, the Injil was retained in some degree, because you can see Isa doing certain things in the Gospels that were very much opposed to current Christianity today. He eats kosher food. He acts like a Jew throughout the Gospels. Paul doesn't, but you know, Isa is very much Jewish. And he even says, in the gospel accounts, a lot of Christians say, Christianity was given to all of mankind. But Isa himself says in the Gospels that I only came for the Jews. I didn't come for the Gentiles. But the Christians, they explain this away by saying, well, Paul met Jesus later on after he died in some dream or something, and Jesus said, okay, now you can go to the non-Jewish people. And so, anyways, I'm sorry, okay, I just done ranting, but like I said, we're going to have a break now, and then we're going to start the next session. I'll probably get into the hudud in that one, and we will discuss atheist psychology, how to do da'wah to atheists, and also basically how to debate. And I will be giving you some examples from my own life, so you can see what I say and what I do. Okay, so at 11 o'clock, you are dismissed.